Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff. Picture this. It's a sweltering summer night in 48 BC. A 21-year-old woman sits in exile from her own kingdom. Her 13-year-old brother, manipulated by scheming advisors, has stolen her throne and kicked her out. Her ragtag army camps in the Syrian desert, hopelessly outnumbered. She's an orphan, an outcast, and by every measure her story should end right here. But she's not just any young woman. She knows the most powerful man alive, Julius Caesar, has just arrived in her capital, Alexandria. He's chasing his defeated rival Pompey, and now holds her kingdom's fate in his hands. She desperately needs to see him, but there's a problem. Her brother's army blocks every land route, and his ships patrol the waters. She's completely trapped. So what does she do? She comes up with a plan so bold, so outrageous, it sounds more like fiction than history. Under cover of darkness, a trusted servant rows a small boat into the harbor, right under the palace walls. Inside that boat, the queen crawls into a large sack, the kind used for bedding or scrolls. Her servant rolls it up, hoists it over his shoulder, and walks brazenly past enemy guards, straight into Caesar's private quarters. There, he unrolls the sack, and out steps the rightful queen of Egypt. That woman was Cleopatra, and in that single moment, she didn't just fight for her throne. She launched herself into legend. This isn't a scene from Hollywood. It's one of the few verified stories we have about one of history's most famous women. And it's the key to understanding who she really was. For 2,000 years, we've been fed a story about Cleopatra the seductress, the temptress who enslaved great Roman men with her beauty. But the woman who emerged from that sack wasn't playing the siren. She was a strategist. Not a romantic, but a ruler fighting for survival. In her magnificent biography, Cleopatra, A Life, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Stacy Schiff goes on a remarkable journey. She peels away centuries of myth and propaganda, written almost entirely by Cleopatra's Roman enemies, to find the real woman underneath. It's essentially a detective story, piecing together a life from fragments of a historical record that's biased, incomplete, and often deliberately silent. Today we're going to explore what this book reveals. It's the story of a brilliant, highly educated, and politically ruthless leader, a woman who ruled a vast kingdom, commanded armies and navies, controlled currencies, and spoke 9 languages. By the end, I promise you'll see Cleopatra not as a caricature, but as one of the most capable and formidable figures of the ancient world. A master of power, politics, and persuasion, whose life holds profound lessons for us even today. Let's dive in. To truly understand Cleopatra, we need to understand the world she was born into, and that world was absolutely vicious. Her family, the Ptolemies, weren't even Egyptian. They were Macedonian Greeks, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals who claimed Egypt nearly 300 years earlier. They were outsiders who styled themselves as pharaohs, adopting local traditions to legitimize their power. And they had a family custom that was as bizarre as it was brutal: sibling marriage. The Ptolemies believed this practice, borrowed from ancient pharaohs, would keep their bloodline pure and consolidate power. But what it actually did was turn every family gathering into a potential death match. For generations, the Ptolemaic dynasty was essentially a gruesome soap opera of poisonings, assassinations, and civil wars. Sisters fought brothers. Mothers sent troops against sons. Cleopatra's own great-grandfather killed his 14-year-old son, chopped him into pieces, and delivered the mutilated body parts to the boy's mother, his wife, on the eve of her birthday. This was the family business. Growing up in this environment, Cleopatra learned some hard lessons early. First, power was everything. Second, no one, not your brother, not your sister, not your uncle, could be trusted. And third, the women in her family were just as ruthless, and often far more capable, than the men. She had more powerful female role models than almost any queen in history. These were women who raised fleets, waged military campaigns, and governed empires. They taught her that power wasn't a man's game, it was simply a game. The arena for this game was the most magnificent city in the world, Alexandria. Forget your assumptions about the ancient world. Alexandria, in Cleopatra's day, was like Paris, London, and New York rolled into one. It was a gleaming metropolis of white marble, with a 400-foot lighthouse that was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its main boulevard was so wide that 8 chariots could drive side by side. It was a bustling, multicultural hub of commerce, art, and intellect. Most importantly, it housed the Great Library and its attached museum, which was less a museum and more the world's first state-funded research institute. It was the greatest center of learning in existence, and it was literally in Cleopatra's backyard. While Rome was still a provincial town of brick and plaster, Alexandrians were measuring Earth's circumference, placing the sun at the center of the solar system, and codifying geometry. Cleopatra received the best education available in the Hellenistic world. She was groomed for the throne, fluent in 9 languages, the first and only Ptolemy to bother learning the native Egyptian tongue of the people she ruled. She studied literature, politics, rhetoric, astronomy, and mathematics. She was trained by the most gifted scholars of her time. By her teenage years, she wasn't just a princess. She was an intellectual heavyweight, a silver-tongued debater, and a charismatic leader comfortable among ambassadors and politicians. She would need every ounce of that training, because as she came of age, a dark cloud was gathering on the horizon. A power so vast and so hungry it was systematically swallowing the world. That power was Rome. Throughout her childhood, Cleopatra watched as the Roman Republic extended its rule to Egypt's very borders. The once great Ptolemaic Empire had been reduced to a shadow of itself, a wealthy but wobbly kingdom teetering on the edge of becoming a Roman province. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known to his subjects as Auletes, the flute player, spent his reign in a degrading dance of submission to Rome. He paid staggering sums to be officially named a, quote, friend and ally of the Roman people, a title that cost him a fortune and the respect of his own subjects. He was forced to tax his people mercilessly to pay his Roman bribes, which only made them hate him more. When his subjects finally drove him from Egypt, he fled to Rome, where he spent 3 years begging and bribing Roman politicians to restore him to his throne. Cleopatra, a young adolescent at the time, watched all of this unfold. She learned a critical lesson from her father's humiliation. It wasn't enough to be a friend to Rome. You had to be a friend to the most powerful Roman of the day. The problem was, in the chaotic late Republic, torn apart by civil wars, it was never clear who that person was. Her father had thrown his lot in with Pompey the Great, a brilliant general who seemed destined for eternal success. But just as Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, inherited the throne in 51 BC, Pompey entered into a bloody civil war against his rival, a man named Julius Caesar. At just 18 years old, Cleopatra stepped into this minefield. She was meant to rule jointly with her brother, as his wife, but this was a woman who was never going to play second fiddle. She quickly pushed her young brother aside, issuing decrees and minting coins with her face alone, but the court advisors who controlled her brother, a eunuch named Pothinus, a rhetoric teacher named Theodotus, and an army commander named Achillas, weren't about to let a teenage girl rule alone. They saw her ambition, her independence, and they feared it. So they staged a coup. They used a famine, caused by poor flooding of the Nile, to turn the people against her. They drove her out of Alexandria, and by the summer of 48 BC, Cleopatra found herself in exile, raising a mercenary army in the desert, preparing to fight her own brother for the kingdom she believed was hers. This is the moment just before she rolled herself into that fateful sack. Pompey, her family's longtime patron, had just been crushed by Caesar in Greece. He fled to Egypt, seeking refuge. But Ptolemy's advisors saw an opportunity. To win the favor of the new master of the world, Julius Caesar, they decided to make him a gift. As Pompey stepped ashore, they stabbed him to death and cut off his head. "Dead men don't bite," the rhetoric teacher smugly declared. They believed this gruesome act would win Caesar's favor. They were wrong. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he turned away in horror. Pompey may have been his enemy, but he was also a great Roman and his former son-in-law. This was no way to treat a Roman. Caesar installed himself in the royal palace and, asserting his authority as a representative of Rome, summoned the feuding siblings, Cleopatra and her brother, to appear before him. And this brings us back to that incredible gamble. Cleopatra knew her brother's advisors would never let her reach Caesar. They would slander her, undermine her, and likely kill her before she ever got the chance to plead her case. So she did the one thing they never expected. She made herself invisible. She smuggled herself into the one place she was forbidden to go, her own home. The shock of her appearance before Caesar cannot be overstated. Here was a man who prided himself on his speed, his intuition, his ability to anticipate his enemy's every move. He was 52 years old, a veteran of countless campaigns, a master strategist who had conquered Gaul and defeated the mighty Pompey. He was not an easy man to surprise. And yet, here before him stood a 21-year-old queen, emerging not in royal splendor, but from a dusty bag, having outwitted an entire army to reach him. In that moment, Caesar didn't see a seductress. He saw a kindred spirit. He saw the same ingenuity, the same bold decision-making, the same gambler's instinct that had defined his own life. The popular story, the one written by his enemies, is that Caesar was instantly, quote, captivated and enslaved by her charm, but the reality was far more political. Caesar needed a stable Egypt, and more importantly, he needed Egypt's money. He had an army to pay and debts to settle. Ptolemy's advisors had just murdered a Roman. Aligning with them was politically toxic. Cleopatra, on the other hand, was a deposed queen with nothing to lose and everything to gain by aligning with him. Survival, not seduction, was first on her mind. The morning after her arrival, Caesar proposed a reconciliation. Cleopatra and her brother would rule jointly, as their father's will had stipulated. Ptolemy's advisors were furious. Young Ptolemy himself flew into a rage, bursting into tears and storming into the streets, crying that he had been betrayed. The city of Alexandria, already wary of a Roman in their palace, erupted into chaos. What Caesar thought would be a simple arbitration turned into a full-scale war. He found himself trapped in the palace, vastly outnumbered, under siege by the Egyptian army and the furious Alexandrian mob. And for 6 nerve-wracking months, from the fall of 48 BC into the spring of 47, Julius Caesar and Cleopatra were holed up together, fighting for their lives. It was in the crucible of this war that their alliance was forged. They weren't just political partners, they were comrades in arms. In the quiet moments between battles, they talked. He, the seasoned general, would have been fascinated by this brilliant young woman who knew military affairs, who could discuss philosophy and science, who moved with an effortless authority he had never seen in a Roman woman. And she, the young queen fighting for her kingdom, saw in him the one man who could secure her future. Their relationship was born of mutual admiration, shared danger, and powerful political calculation. By early November, that alliance had become intimate. Cleopatra realized she was pregnant. When Roman reinforcements finally arrived and Caesar crushed the Egyptian army, drowning Cleopatra's young brother in the Nile in the process, he did not annex Egypt as a Roman province, as he could have. Instead, he placed Cleopatra firmly on the throne, with her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as her nominal co-ruler. Why did he stay? After the war ended in March, Caesar lingered in Egypt until June. The official excuse was unfavorable winds. The unofficial reason was Cleopatra. They took a luxurious cruise up the Nile, a journey of several weeks on a magnificent royal barge. It was part political tour, part victory lap, and part honeymoon. Cleopatra introduced Caesar to the wonders of her ancient land, the pyramids, the temples, the vibrant culture that existed far beyond the Greek world of Alexandria. It was here that Caesar, the ultimate Roman, was fully exposed to the intoxicating allure of the East, a world of divine monarchy, unimaginable wealth, and a civilization that made Rome look like a provincial backwater. In late June, shortly after Caesar departed, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. The Alexandrians nicknamed him Caesarion, or Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this was the ultimate political triumph. She now had an heir, and that heir was the son of the most powerful man in the world. The child embodied her dream, a future where Egypt and Rome could be united, not through conquest, but through a shared dynasty. 2 years later, in 46 BC, Cleopatra traveled to Rome. She came not as a conquered subject, but as an allied queen, at Caesar's invitation. She settled in his lavish villa across the Tiber River, with her infant son and her brother husband in tow, and her presence sent shockwaves through the city. Rome was a city of rigid tradition, where women were expected to be modest, silent, and invisible in public life. Cleopatra was none of those things. She was a foreign monarch, a ruler in her own right, fabulously wealthy and intellectually brilliant. She was the unmarried mother of Caesar's only son, living openly in his villa, while his Roman wife Calpurnia lived across town. She was, in short, everything a proper Roman woman was not. To the Romans, she was an object of fascination and suspicion. Her influence on Caesar was obvious. He reformed the hopelessly messy Roman calendar, adopting the more precise Egyptian solar calendar, the basis of the calendar we still use today. He planned to build a great public library modeled on Alexandria's. Most provocatively, he placed a life-size golden statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the mythical ancestor of his own family. He was treating her not as a mistress, but as a goddess, a consort. The Roman aristocracy was horrified. They saw in her the corrupting influence of the East. They whispered that Caesar, who had recently been named dictator for life, had monarchical ambitions. They feared he planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria and rule with Cleopatra as his queen. One man in particular despised her, the great orator, Cicero. "I detest the queen," he fumed in a letter. To him, her arrogance was insufferable. She was too intelligent, too independent, too regal. She acted like she owned the place, which, from her perspective, wasn't entirely untrue. She came from a world of divine kings and queens. He came from a republic that had built its identity on crushing them. The tension in Rome was thick with fear and resentment. Caesar's power had grown absolute, and his behavior increasingly autocratic. He seemed out of touch with the Senate, more interested in planning a grand new campaign against Parthia in the East than in restoring the republic at home. Whether Cleopatra was the cause of this change or simply a convenient scapegoat, she became the symbol of everything that was going wrong. On the Ides of March 44 BC, a group of senators calling themselves the Liberators cornered Julius Caesar in a meeting hall and stabbed him to death. With those 23 dagger blows, Cleopatra's world was shattered for a second time. She had lost her protector, her partner, and the father of her child. Her champion was gone, and Rome descended into a bloodbath of riots, arson, and political chaos. She was now in mortal danger. She and her court fled the city as quickly as they could, sailing back to an Egypt that was once again adrift in uncertainty. She returned to Alexandria a changed woman. She was 26 years old, a veteran of war and Roman politics. She knew she could no longer rely on a single powerful patron. The game had changed, so she changed her strategy. Her first move was to secure her own power base. Her younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, was now 15. He was a potential rival, a pawn that could be used against her, Cleopatra was not one to trip over the same stone twice. She had him poisoned. Then, in a brilliant stroke of political theater, she named her 3-year-old son, Caesarion, as her co-regent. He was now King Ptolemy, who is as well Caesar, father-loving, mother-loving god. She had her male consort, as tradition demanded, but this one was a toddler she could completely control. More importantly, a living, breathing son of Julius Caesar now sat on the Egyptian throne. It was a powerful message to the warring factions in Rome. And she began to lean heavily into her divine identity. She started appearing in public dressed as the goddess Isis, the most powerful and beloved deity in Egypt. Isis was the consummate earth mother, the protector of children, the goddess who brought order from chaos. With Caesar martyred and her divine son at her side, Cleopatra seamlessly stepped into the role of the grieving, powerful goddess wife. A story that resonated deeply with her Egyptian subjects. For the next few years, as Rome tore itself apart in another round of civil wars, Cleopatra ruled Egypt with a firm and capable hand. She navigated a devastating famine and plague, opened the royal granaries to feed her people, and kept her kingdom stable and prosperous while the rest of the world burned. The Roman conflict eventually distilled into a contest between two men, Caesar's adopted son and heir, the cold, calculating 18-year-old Octavian, and Caesar's charismatic, hard-drinking, and brilliant lieutenant, Mark Antony. After they joined forces to hunt down and defeat Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi, they divided the world between them. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east. And that meant, sooner or later, Antony would come calling on the Queen of Egypt. In the summer of 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, a city on the coast of modern-day Turkey. He wanted an explanation. Why had she been so lukewarm in her support of the Caesarians during the Civil War? And, more to the point, he needed money for his planned invasion of Parthia. Cleopatra knew this was a command performance, but she had learned from her first encounter with a Roman strongman. This time, she would not arrive as a supplicant smuggled in a sack. This time, she would arrive as a goddess. She sailed up the river Cydnus to Tarsus in a magnificent barge with a gilded stern and purple sails. Silver oars beat time to the music of flutes and pipes. She herself reclined under a gold-spangled canopy, dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess of love, surrounded by young boys dressed as cupids. Her maids, dressed as sea nymphs, stood at the rudder and the ropes. The air for miles along the riverbanks was filled with the scent of incense. The entire city of Tarsus emptied out to witness the spectacle, leaving Mark Antony sitting all alone in the marketplace where he had been conducting business. A message arrived for him. Venus had come to revel with Bacchus, the god Antony styled himself after for the good of Asia. It was one of the most masterful displays of personal branding in history. Antony, a man who loved grand gestures and extravagant pleasures, was utterly enchanted. He invited her to dinner. She replied that he should come to her instead. He did. The banquet she prepared was so lavish it defied description. The floors were strewn knee-deep with roses. The tableware was solid gold, encrusted with gems. At the end of the night, she gave it all to him as a gift. The plates, the goblets, even the couches. Antony was 42, a battle-hardened veteran, a notorious womanizer, but he had never encountered anyone like this. Here was a woman who was not only beautiful and charming, but was his equal in wit, intelligence, and ambition. She could hunt and drink and play dice with him, she could match his coarse, soldierly humor, and she could govern a kingdom. He was smitten. Before she left Tarsus, Antony had met her demands. He had her rebellious younger sister, Arsinoe, dragged from the sanctuary of a temple and executed. He eliminated all of her political rivals. And then, he did something that would change the course of history. He postponed his great Parthian campaign and followed her back to Alexandria for the winter. That winter of 41 to 40 BC became the stuff of legend. They formed a society they called the Inimitable Livers, a group dedicated to a life of pleasure and extravagance that went beyond belief. They feasted, they drank, they threw lavish parties. They wandered the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise, playing pranks on the city's inhabitants. For Antony, it was a holiday from the grim business of Roman politics. For Cleopatra, it was a masterclass in diplomacy. She kept him entertained, at her side, and under her influence. But Antony was a Roman, and he had a wife, the formidable Fulvia, who was back in Italy stirring up a war against Octavian, partly to lure her husband away from his Egyptian dalliance. Antony was eventually forced to leave Alexandria to deal with the political fallout. Fulvia conveniently died, and to patch up his alliance with Octavian, Antony did the politically expedient thing. He married Octavian's beautiful, virtuous, and universally admired sister, Octavia. For nearly 4 years, Cleopatra did not see Mark Antony. During that time, she gave birth to his twins, a boy she named Alexander Helios the sun, and a girl she named Cleopatra Selene the moon. She continued to rule her kingdom, waiting, knowing that Antony's fragile peace with Octavian could not last. Antony needed her wealth for his Eastern ambitions, and his Roman marriage was a political necessity, not a partnership. She was right. In the autumn of 37 BC, Antony, frustrated with Octavian's political games and finally ready to launch his Parthian war, sent Octavia back to Rome and summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Antioch. Their reunion was both personal and political. He publicly acknowledged their twins, and he made her an extraordinary gift. He restored to Egypt many of the territories it had lost over the previous centuries: Cyprus, parts of Syria, the coast of Lebanon. He essentially gave her back the Ptolemaic Empire. Cleopatra declared a new era. She was now Queen of Kings, and he was her undisputed partner. They were, for all intents and purposes, married. This was the peak of her power. She ruled a vast territory, richer and more secure than any Ptolemy in generations. And she had the might of Rome's greatest general at her side. But this act, the donations of Alexandria, was a fatal miscalculation. While it made perfect sense in the Hellenistic East, where kings bestowed kingdoms, in Rome it was seen as an outrageous betrayal. Antony was giving away Roman territory to his foreign mistress, and this was the opening Octavian had been waiting for. For years, Octavian had been quietly consolidating his power in the West, building a base of support and waiting for Antony to stumble. Now he launched one of the most brilliant and vicious propaganda campaigns in history. He didn't attack Antony as a Roman rival. He attacked him as a traitor who had been bewitched by a foreign sorceress. This wasn't a civil war between two Romans, Octavian declared. This was a war to save Rome from an Eastern menace. Cleopatra, he claimed, was a drunken, depraved harlot queen who planned to conquer Rome and move the capital to Alexandria. Antony was no longer a Roman. He was her effeminate slave, a man who had abandoned his virtuous Roman wife for a, quote, serpent of the Nile. The propaganda was brutally effective. It preyed on every Roman fear: fear of powerful women, fear of monarchy, and fear of the decadent East. In 32 BC, after Antony officially divorced Octavia, Octavian persuaded the Senate to declare war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. He had masterfully reframed the conflict. He was not fighting a fellow Roman, he was defending Rome from a foreign invader. The final showdown came in September of 31 BC at the naval battle of Actium, off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra had the larger, heavier ships and the more experienced commanders. But Octavian had a brilliant admiral named Agrippa, who used his lighter, swifter vessels to outmaneuver them. The battle itself was confused and indecisive for hours. Then, in a move that has been debated for 2 millennia, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships hoisted their sails, broke through the center of the battle line, and fled south toward Egypt. Moments later, Mark Antony abandoned his flagship, transferred to a smaller vessel, and followed her. Was it a pre-planned escape? A cowardly betrayal? Did she flee? And did he, love-struck and mindless, follow her? The Roman version, of course, is that Antony threw away an empire for a woman. the reality is likely more complex. Their position was desperate, their supply lines had been cut, their men were suffering from disease, and desertions were rampant. The plan was likely a desperate gamble to break through the blockade and retreat to Egypt to regroup, but the plan, whatever it was, went disastrously wrong. The bulk of Antony's fleet, left behind, surrendered. A week later, his land army, leaderless and demoralized, did the same. The 3 days it took to sail south were silent and agonizing. Antony sat alone at the prow of Cleopatra's flagship, head in his hands, refusing to speak to her. He had not just lost a battle. He had deserted his men. He had lost his honor. And in doing so, he had lost the world. They returned to Alexandria to find themselves alone, surrounded by enemies. The client kings who had supported them defected to Octavian. Herod, the king of Judea, who owed his throne to Antony, was among the first to switch sides. Cleopatra, ever the pragmatist, was a whirlwind of activity. She tried to have her ships dragged overland to the Red Sea to escape to India. She executed her political opponents. She began experimenting with poisons, searching for one that would provide a quick and painless death. Antony, by contrast, fell into deep despair. He built a small hut on a pier in the harbor and lived as a hermit, calling himself Timon of Athens, a man who hated all mankind for its ingratitude. Cleopatra eventually coaxed him back to the palace. They dissolved the inimitable livers and formed a new society, the Companions to the Death. Over the winter they sent desperate embassies to Octavian. Cleopatra offered to abdicate in favor of her children. Antony offered to kill himself if it would save her. Octavian's reply was cold and calculating. Publicly, he threatened her. Privately, he sent messages saying he would be merciful, if only she would get rid of Antony. It was a game of psychological warfare, and Cleopatra knew she could not win. She moved her most valuable treasures, gold, silver, pearls, ivory, into a magnificent 2-story mausoleum she had built next to a temple of Isis. And she let it be known that if Octavian pushed her too far, she would set it all ablaze, destroying a fortune he desperately needed to pay his veterans. In the summer of 30 BC, Octavian's legions arrived at the gates of Alexandria. Antony mustered what was left of his forces for one last, desperate charge. He won a small victory, and for a fleeting moment, the old fire returned. He galloped back to the palace, still in his armor, and kissed Cleopatra in triumph. The next morning, August 1st, he prepared for a final battle, but as his fleet sailed out to meet Octavian's, it simply surrendered without a fight. His cavalry deserted, his infantry was quickly defeated, the end had come. In a rage, Antony stormed back to the palace, screaming that Cleopatra had betrayed him, but she was gone. Fearing his wrath, she had fled to her mausoleum with 2 loyal maids and barricaded herself inside. Then she sent a message to Antony. It was a message that told him she was dead. Whether she meant to deceive him into taking his own life, or whether the message was simply bungled, we will never know. But Antony believed it. "I am not distressed to have lost you," he cried out, "for I shall straightway join you. But I am grieved that a commander as great as I should be found to be inferior to a woman in courage." He asked his servant, Eros, to kill him. Instead, Eros killed himself. Taking the sword, Antony plunged it into his own stomach. He botched the job. Mortally wounded but still alive, he lay in agony, begging his attendants to finish him. They fled. Then word came. The queen was alive, in her monument. Antony had his servants carry him to the foot of the mausoleum. From a window high above, Cleopatra and her 2 maids let down ropes. They hoisted the dying, blood-soaked Antony up the wall. It was a piteous, terrible sight. He died in her arms. Octavian wanted Cleopatra alive. A living queen would be the star attraction of his triumphal parade in Rome. He sent his men to capture her They tricked their way into the mausoleum and seized her before she could stab herself with a dagger she had hidden in her clothes. For 9 days she was Octavian's prisoner. He treated her with respect, but she knew her fate. She was 39 years old. She had been a goddess, a queen, the ruler of an empire. She would not be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, a living trophy for the man who had destroyed her world. She requested an interview with Octavian. She tried every tool in her arsenal, her charm, her wit, her intelligence, her tears. She begged for her kingdom to be passed to her children. Octavian remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the floor, promising her nothing but good treatment, all the while thinking of the glory she would bring to his triumph. He thought he had deceived her, but it was he who was deceived. On August 10th, she received a secret message from a sympathetic Roman. Octavian planned to ship her and her children to Rome in 3 days. The time had come. She asked for permission to make final offerings at Antony's tomb. Then, she returned to her mausoleum, took a bath, and enjoyed a sumptuous last meal. Later that afternoon, a countryman arrived with a basket of figs. The guards inspected it, saw nothing but the fruit, and let him pass. Inside the mausoleum, Cleopatra sealed a letter to Octavian and dismissed all of her attendants except her 2 faithful maids, Iris and Charmian. When Octavian received the letter and read her plea to be buried beside Antony, he knew at once what she had done. His men rushed to the mausoleum and burst through the doors. They were too late. Cleopatra lay dead on a golden couch, dressed in her full royal regalia. Iris was dying at her feet. Charmian, staggering and near death herself, was trying to adjust the diadem on her mistress's head. "A fine deed this, Charmian," one of the Roman soldiers snapped. "It is indeed most fine," she replied, her final words a tribute to her queen, and befitting the descendant of so many kings. Then she too collapsed and died. How did she do it? The legend, of course, says it was an asp, a cobra hidden in the fig basket. Octavian himself promoted this story, even displaying an effigy of her with a snake in his triumph. The asp was a potent symbol of Egyptian royalty and the goddess Isis. It made for a better story. But the truth, as historian Stacy Schiff makes clear, is that no one knows. A cobra is an unlikely weapon for a woman known for meticulous planning. It's a slow, painful, and unreliable way to die. It's more likely she used a fast-acting poison, a toxic ointment, or a pin dipped in a lethal concoction, something she had spent months researching. Her final act was her ultimate victory. She had taken control of her own death. She had preserved her dignity, and she had robbed Octavian of his greatest prize. He could conquer her kingdom, he could seize her treasure, he could murder her son, but he could not humiliate her. In death, she escaped him. The last queen of Egypt would not be a footnote in a Roman triumph. She would be the author of her own final chapter. Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra is more than just a biography. It's a profound meditation on power, propaganda, and the way history is written. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra's story was told by her conquerors. They needed a villain for their story of Roman triumph, and they created one. The exotic, hypersexualized Eastern queen who brought a great Roman general to his knees. What Schiff does so brilliantly is reclaim the story, to show us that Cleopatra's power came not from her beauty, but from her brains. One of the most powerful lessons from this book is about the persistent, and often insidious, link between female power and sexuality. Cleopatra was a brilliant politician, a capable ruler, a skilled diplomat, and a shrewd strategist. But in the Roman imagination, and for centuries after, her accomplishments were consistently attributed to her feminine wiles. She wasn't strategic, she was seductive. She wasn't intelligent, she was manipulative. It was easier for her enemies to believe she had bewitched Antony with magic arts and charms than to admit she might have outthought him, or that their alliance was a rational partnership based on mutual need and ambition. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. A powerful woman is often seen as a threat, and one of the easiest ways to neutralize that threat is to reduce her to her sexuality. to dismiss her accomplishments as the product of seduction rather than skill. Cleopatra's story is a stark reminder to look past the caricature, to question the narrative, especially when that narrative is written by the victors. Another incredible lesson is the sheer power of resilience. Think about her journey. She was exiled as a teenager, hunted by her own brother. Her first great ally and the father of her child was assassinated. She navigated years of brutal Roman civil wars, always on a knife's edge. Her second great ally and the father of 3 more of her children was defeated and driven to suicide. Her kingdom was conquered. And yet at no point did she simply surrender to her fate. From smuggling herself into the palace in a sack, to attempting to drag her fleet across the desert, her life was a series of audacious, inventive, and relentless efforts to turn a desperate situation to her advantage. She lost in the end, but she fought with every tool at her disposal until the very last moment. Her story isn't just a tragedy. It's a masterclass in crisis management and the art of the improbable comeback. So how can we apply some of this to our own lives? Well, you don't need to rule an empire to learn from her. First, take control of your own narrative. Cleopatra was a master of self-presentation. Whether she was appearing as the goddess Isis or staging an impossibly lavish banquet, she understood the power of image and story. She crafted her own legend. In a world where others will always try to define you, her life is a powerful argument for defining yourself, for telling your own story with confidence and conviction. Second, embrace your education. Cleopatra's greatest weapon wasn't a sword or a fleet, it was her mind. Her deep knowledge of history, politics, and language gave her an edge in every negotiation. She was a product of the greatest intellectual center of her time, and she used that knowledge to outmaneuver her rivals. It's a timeless lesson. The more you learn, the more options you have. The more you understand the world, the better equipped you are to navigate it. That was our journey through Cleopatra: A Life by Stacy Schiff. We've touched on the major moments today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only take you so far. The real magic happens when you read the book for yourself. It's in the rich details, the quiet moments of analysis, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is a map, designed to help you decide if this is a journey worth taking. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see power, politics, and the enduring strength of a remarkable woman. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable and want to continue exploring the world's most influential books, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets us know we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.